Good evening and welcome to the fourth, up to four already in our series of webinars. And for those of you that don't know me from previous webinars, I'm William Stockdale, Chair of Thornton-le-Street History Group. Tonight we have a speaker who's very, very close to our hearts, and that's James Brightman, archaeologist and heritage consultant from Solstice Heritage. And Jim was our archaeologist for our Roads to the Past project, so we know him very, very well. Tonight, Jim is going to be talking about traditional farm buildings of the Yorkshire Dales, which again is a local subject and which should be of interest to a lot of people. If you do have any questions, do please type them into the Q&A box. They will be moderated, so your question might not get answered. And again, we'll only have a certain amount of time to answer questions, but we'll do our very, very best to answer as many as we can. Okay, I'll now hand myself over to Jim, and Jim will take us forward with his talk. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Bill. Let me just share the screen so everyone can see the slide. Excellent. I can see, yeah, Pam nodding. Yes, you can see the screen. Fantastic. Thanks to Thornton-le-Street History Group for inviting me along to be part of this series of webinars. I think it's a fantastic endeavour at this sort of weird time in our world that we can still meet up. I'm still able to sort of get out to virtually to local history groups and talk about different aspects, different projects. I'll throw myself into this because I've got quite a few slides and I want to make sure I get through all of them. I'm doing this talk with a slightly different hat on than just my Solstice Heritage hat. A lot of what I'm going to talk about tonight came from a project that I undertook, Solstice Heritage and me undertook in partnership with the Yorkshire Dales National Park Authority a few years ago now, actually, which was called farm characterisation. It's something that's been funded by Historic England and has been rolled out over lots of different regions, particularly national parks, but county areas as well. And it's an effort to look at the resource that historic farms and farm buildings represent, how we can manage those. Really, it's a census of what's there to start with, but also to identify what's important and what's unique in the character of farm buildings given in a particular area. Obviously, the Yorkshire Dales, as this beautiful rural national park, therefore a protected landscape, has a very distinct agricultural heritage. Now, in terms of the structure of the talk, I will look at barns and farmsteads through the first, say, third or half, some lovely pictures, and that's probably what everyone's here for. I'm then going to talk a bit about some of the wider patterns that we found when we were analysing the data from the traditional farm buildings characterisation project. And then I will wrap up with everyone's favourite thrilling topic, which is how we manage traditional farm buildings through the planning process. It's not quite as dry as it sounds, actually. It's important, and there are some interesting things happening there. So I won't, don't turn off at that point. Okay, to kick off then, this is a view across one of the smaller dales in the Yorkshire Dales, Lytton Dale, what we think of as a very traditional view of the Yorkshire Dales farmed landscape, meadow to a barn in the background, beautiful dry stone walling, meandering river. The picture in the top left, didn't really need to include it here, but that's me exercising my bona fides with a picture of my granddad and my great uncle raking bracken at Garsdale Head in the mid-1920s. And I use that to justify why someone who perhaps wasn't born inside the Yorkshire Dales does at least have something of a link to talk about its farming heritage. Care about barns? Why do we care about something that's ubiquitous or fairly ubiquitous across the rural landscape? Why do we care about something that isn't a grand villa, a great house, a huge municipal building with beautiful, what we term polite architecture. Well, hopefully everyone already does, but I'll explain why we do. It's the opposite of polite architecture, isn't rude architecture, it's vernacular architecture. And vernacular architecture is really the practical architecture of the people. It's not purely functional, it's not purely utilitarian, though most buildings we would classify as vernacular have that as a major concern and start out that way. But looking at this picture here, you can see that this is a practical building. It's 4 square, it's built out of local stone. It has, if I move my cursor just over there, it has these breathers, so ventilation slits to allow ventilation in and out of the building. It has a single door, a single window, but there are little elements within it which are embellishment. The door doesn't need to look like that. It doesn't need to have these great big stone blocks with imposts beneath the lintel. These through, or as they're sometimes called in the top of the Dales, through stones, stone throughs that tie the wall together. They have a practical purpose, but they needn't be positioned so regularly. They could be contained within the core of the wall by and large, whereas actually it creates an aesthetic to this vernacular architecture. This is all by way of me saying that I think vernacular architecture, and in particular barns, are really quite beautiful buildings, far and above what you can read from them, what they can tell you about the people who built them and the people who used them. I think they're really lovely to look at because they have an aesthetic, but they also scratch the itch of wanting to unpick them, of wanting to work out how they developed, what were they used for. They're a historical document in their own right, in a way which quite often large grand buildings which are built maybe in one phase, in like a town hall or a town centre, it's a statement of a single time, whereas this barn is the biography of several hundred years of agriculture in that specific area. There is also a huge value to vernacular architecture in as much as they are lived in and used buildings. They have a life of their own. This is a beautiful example of some graffiti in a field barn in Swaledale, and it records the different hay timing through the course of 3 years. So hay timing 5th of September in 1954, really late, that's quite late. Started hay 6th of July 1955, finished we think 3rd or 5th of July 1955, finished hay 19th of September 1956, went on holidays in Blackpool September 1950. So it's a lovely thing. It gives an immediacy to that architecture and that building. It connects us very, very, very clearly to the past. But also, that's a great historical document in its own right. It shows us that in 1955, they'd finished hay by the end of July, whereas more typically in the 2 years either side it, they were finishing in September. It tells us something about the climate, tells us something about the weather at that period, and it tells us something about the farming year and how that whole system of their farming worked. And it tells us that they enjoyed going on holiday to Blackpool, probably in a package holiday. There's also a huge value in vernacular architecture in, I've already hinted at this, but reading the biography of a building. It's often easier within a vernacular building than it is within a polite architectural building. And so this here, this barn, well, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, there's 5 immediate phases just within a quick glance of that. We have a beautiful example of an early thatched roof, this thatch line captured within where the eaves have later been raised to take a stone roof. So we've got instantly we've got an early development of a building. And then beyond that, we've got an outshot over to the right. We have a gable end outshot, a single story added, then we've got a little coal hole added in brick, and the brick stands out against the stone, showing us it's much more modern. Instantly there, we are able to talk about, knowing when, say, thatched buildings were common, we're able to look at a barn that's developed from, say, the 17th century all the way through into the 20th century. And they're allowed to survive in this where they are useful agricultural buildings. Yes, okay, we may say that that little brick with asbestos sheeting roof coal hole is a bit of a modern eyesore. I mean, it's a mid-20th century eyesore, which no longer is modern, unfortunately. But it's an integral part of why this building has survived, because it's useful to the present day. So field barns. I promised I'd talk about field barns. Field barns are synonymous in many ways with certain core parts of the Yorkshire Dales. They are a characteristic such that they have their own protection in certain parts of the national park. And they are a hugely important thing for understanding the agricultural development of the last at least couple of hundred years. The field barn is part of a now gone agricultural system, completely disappeared. It's part of a dairying agricultural system whereby the field barn houses cattle, and it also houses the cattle's fodder, and then the manure that's shoveled out from the field barn is used to fertilize the field wherein the field barn is and the cows live. So it's this circular symbiotic system whereby one field, one barn, one set of cows, one group of cows that live in that field barn are fed there, and then their manure fertilizes the field, grows some of their fodder. And the money, the way that that system is made, the money is made in the surplus dairy products that can be brought out of that system. So the cows live in the barn, the field supports them, they support the field, and then the farmer takes the dairy products out of that, and those are a high value product. They're a high yield. So that's the very sort of a very basic overview of how the field barn works. It's completely different to large centralized farms where the cattle go out to or the animals, whichever animals, but in this case cattle, go out to the fields and then are brought back to the central farm every day, every night to be stalled and to be fed, where they're not grazing on the grass. So that's a centralized system. This is a completely dispersed system with a relatively small central farm, but then a wide area where each field is served by its own barn and has its own sheep, and the farmer moves around and goes out to the animals rather than the animals coming back to them. It became completely economically unviable, particularly into the late 19th century, but as of the early 20th century, with increasing mechanization of farms, the conglomerization of the actual farmland, this is just not an economically viable system. So this is why the fields of the Dales are scattered with the remnants of field barns that are a fragment of a now defunct past. Huge amounts of them now are just sheep houses. They've had the doors knocked off and they are just used as sheep shelters. Some are still used for other purposes, and I'll get onto that a little bit later. So this is a classic picture by Robert. I should at least name check Rob White, who is formerly the kind of senior archaeologist at the Yorkshire Dales National Park, retired a few years ago to go on holiday to Patagonia and spend time with his barns. But this is a classic picture from one of Robert's books. He really well, in many ways, he actually wrote the book on the Yorkshire Dales. He literally did. But this is a cutaway section. What I've just been talking about, the field barn, here, this is a two-door field barn. They come in all manner of types. We love a typology as building historians and archaeologists. This is a two-door field barn. So you have access direct to where the animals are stalled. This is the shippen. in Yorkshire Dales terms, and then you have a separate door for people to access where the fodder is stored. And this is the mew or hay mew. There is normally also a hay loft above the shippen and the stalls. These are boskins. The terminology gets, I love the terminology, but it gets quite confusing after a while, because it all probably comes ultimately from Vikings. There's a very sort of Scandinavian aspect to a lot of particularly Northern Dales dialects. You've got a mucking out hole at the back. So animals go in, fodder gets thrown in from the field to the top here, stored, they're fed, and then I won't describe the exact process whereby the manure comes out into here and is then shoveled out into a manure trap and is then taken out to fertilize the field. It's a really elegant system in many ways. It's not just about what it can tell us about the wider system, though. On a very micro scale, these are beautiful buildings, and they're beautiful examples of historic buildings, and can conceal a huge wealth of little incidental evidence, which we as building historians and archaeologists hugely value. So just a very quick selection of photos I threw up here from various barns and surveys within the Yorkshire Dales. Where original timber work survives, it actually can sometimes be incredibly beautiful. This picture at the top left with what could just be a simple truss, simple tie beam and rafter truss, has actually got a king post pendant dangling. It doesn't connect entirely to the horizontal tie beam there. That's a really beautiful bit of timber framing. It's functional, it's robust, but again, it's this idea of vernacular architecture isn't just purely practical. They quite often go an extra mile to make something aesthetically pleasing or to put a mark on it in some way. And it's discovering those things is a real thrill. On the top right, I think anyone who's done any work on historic buildings, or certainly on timber frame buildings, might recognize the remnants of a crook frame there. And this is very common. Crook frame buildings don't have a lot of space in them, relatively speaking, in comparison to box framed or mass wall buildings like the majority of our barns are. And so crook frame buildings are quite often taken down in favour of replacement or rebuilding in stone. Particularly in the Yorkshire Dales, this happened, and in most rural areas. But you've got these whopping great crook blades, and so where there's a straight enough section, let's just chop it up and use it as a tie beam. And that's exactly what's happened here. This is telling us something about the development even before the barn we were in was built. There were prisoners of war in the Yorkshire Dales, and we've got some rather fabulous surviving pictures of, we're pretty sure it's Lenin on the standing figure on the left there. I think originally people thought it might be Hitler, but actually I'm pretty sure we now think it's Lenin. But these just people idly sketching. A beautiful document of social history, and that's just in a barn in the Yorkshire Dales, whereas, say, for example, the conscientious objector graffiti that's been preserved in Richmond Castle, rightly so, as a wonderful historical artefact, that's been the subject of a good £1 million or more of investment to catalogue and preserve it. This is just on the wall of the barn somewhere. On the bottom right, that's just a particularly good example of where the original features survive internally. And again, we can see that it's this idea that they didn't need to do it that way. That's something that always comes back to me. Almost every barn or farm building I go into, you look at something, you think you didn't need to do it that way. These cattle stalls or boskins, they've beautifully wooden framed with these cranked posts and then infilled with huge blocks of slate. Didn't need to do that. Could have just been timbered, could have just been slatted. But using these upright slates mounted in a beautiful timber frame, when you find something like this, it really is fabulous. And then there's more than just the barns. So field barns are, as I've said, characteristic of certainly specific parts of the Yorkshire Dales, but they're not the only type of farm building. And we can put the rest into sort of rough categories. I had to include a photo of what I'd call a craven lathe. So the lathe or lathe house are particularly large examples of combination barns that include animal stalling and serve the sort of arable landscape around as well, that serve many functions and often have a fodder store, a buyer or shippen associated with it for the animals. And they tend to be really big. So this is Thornton Lonsdale, which is done down in the southern part of the Yorkshire Dales. And you can see automatically, you can see the size of it, where we were looking at a small field barn in its field before. Here we've got, this isn't part of the actual farm. Again, this is out in the field still. This is away from the main farmhouse, but it is a huge complex that is developed over several phases. There is a really tall, wide cart entry there for bringing straw, hay, whatever the crop is, in and out. And quite often these are big enough that they were used for winnowing crops as well. There's a floor in here for crop threshing. And then it's been added to with this great long outshot extension, additional animal stalling space. They are mini farms in their own right, but they lack domestic accommodation. They are still something that is out within the centre of a collection of fields. And that's normally what we see in the southern part of the Yorkshire Dales. In the northern part, we see these many small field barns. In the southern Yorkshire Dales, we tend to see large barn complexes surrounded by fields which it served. So it's a slightly different agricultural regime, though it's still using this same dispersed idea. Still on the west side of the Dales, this is Sedbergh and sort of the head of Garsdale, just near Sedbergh. This is a bank barn, and it's a particularly good example. The idea is absolutely the same. We have space for stalling animals at the bottom here, nice little gable entry door. There'll be stalls either side, so this would actually hold quite a substantial head of cattle in here. But then you can see where the modern door's been added over a huge cart entry on the side. And what makes bank barns different are they're using land that really we shouldn't be building on because it's on such a slope, but they use that to their advantage to have multi-level access all at ground floor, as it were. So you've got a great ramp up here, so you can come straight into the main body of the upper barn with your cart. And there's a little outhouse there, little outshot, possibly for extra animal space. And you can bring all your animals in direct to the ground floor at the base of the building. It generates a huge amount of vertical space for haylofts, for storing fodder in particular. And we see a few of them in the Northern Dales, but like I say, this example's over in the west, in the sort of the Cumbrian Dales, and they do seem to be more concentrated over in that direction. And then there's actually farms themselves. Obviously, I'm talking about a dispersed farming style, and here is a particularly big, I'll be honest, example of a Dales farmstead. We've got a bank barn here, close to the main farmstead itself. Ignore that; that's a later addition. But this is very typical: a linear farm range, a farm range that develops over time. And this was actually two houses originally, and has all been latterly converted into agricultural use. But this was the first house was just this end, and it had a barn attached to it. And this is quite common, rather than say the big sprawling sort of like rectangular planned farmsteads, so like 4 ranges of barns and a farmhouse in the centre of one of the ranges that we see in the lowlands. This is what the Northern Dales farmhouses look like. They are small, they normally have a barn attached to them, and they're normally just part of a linear range which extends over time, gradually spreading out. It's a very distinctive form, and quite often, as this has been in the 20th century or even in the late 19th century, they were converted entirely into barns, and a new farmhouse was built off to one side somewhere. This is a lovely landscape setting. This actually, I believe, this unit is actually for sale. If anyone is feeling particularly flush at the moment, this is a Bell's Farm at Low Whiter that we did some work on. Though I will warn you, there is still a little bit of work to do. And up here, there are some beautiful witch marks stuck into the plaster by the windows and the fireplaces to ward off evil spirits. So it's a really interesting and exciting building, that. But yeah, it's beyond my monetary means, I'll be honest. And then I really should say something about, we don't have many what we'd class as estate farms in the Yorkshire Dales, but there are a couple of really good examples, because there are a couple of large landed estates that own significant portions of what is now the national park. This is Temple Farm at West Whitten, and here you see, like you do sometimes get, the overlap of vernacular and polite architecture. It is still a vernacular building. It is a farm building. It is a farm range. But in this form, by using a low hipped roof, flanking wings to a sort of central, roughly symmetrically arranged large building, these half like demi-lunettes windows, these projecting window surrounds and door surrounds. What it is it's reflecting the polite Georgian architecture of the time it was built. It is taking cues from the grand house that accompanies Temple Farm and others in the sort of the Swynethwaite and West Whitten area estates. And it is incorporating those into what is a practical vernacular building. So it can be read in two ways, but those are a little more rare for us in the Yorkshire Dales. Okay, where are we? We're 2 minutes to 8, I make it. So that's sort of a rattle through of some of the typical types of buildings that we were recording, we were analysing as part of our project, and that you can see as you walk around the Yorkshire Dales. A couple of patterns then that came out. I've only picked out a few. This webinar would end up being 3 hours long if I wanted to go through every interesting little nuance of the data that we pulled out of the project. I should say the project report with all of this data in is available from the Yorkshire Dales National Park website, so it can be downloaded. It was their farmstead characterization report, so people can go and find that. And actually, I might be able to get someone. I'll get someone from the history group to maybe email out a couple of further reading bits and pieces to participants. We'll find some way of doing it. But this is two very quick pictures, two very quick diagrams. The first shows Swaledale, the Swaledale catchment. So Richmond is about there, for anyone who knows that. This is Swaledale all the way up to Meucca, and then Arkengarth Dale, its tributary, with the Arklebeck that runs off there. So this very briefly shows the size of farmsteads. So the core farmstead wherein the farmhouse is, we used a specific metric of kind of footprint against longest. It got complicated, but suffice to say we translated it into 5 categories from very large to very small. And here, the main picture is in the lower reaches of Swaledale. Here, we have fewer, larger farmsteads up to sort of around Reeth, and then a little collection around Langthwaite. As soon as you get up sort of to about Low Row, about here, or past Langthwaite in Arkengarth Dale, you get it. The character is small or very small farmsteads. And that is exactly related to this field barn economy, this field barn system of agriculture, where you have a small farmhouse, a very small core farmstead, and then field barns, a dispersed farm with field barns in every field out in the landscape. there's a couple of weird artifacts like the odd very large farmstead in the upper reaches. Those are actually very large Victorian farms, which comprise the agglomeration of 3 or 4 earlier very small farmsteads. So it skews the data a little bit, but hopefully the picture is overall quite clear there. What I'll do now, however, is I'll flick over to so the western side of the Yorkshire Dales with a map showing farmstead size there and dispersion, and hopefully you'll see the difference there instantly. So this is Garsdale and Dentdale, Sedbergh and the Lune Valley, the northern Lune Valley. Instantly what we see is much more in the way of large, very large farmsteads, even more medium. A marked absence of very small farmsteads, which are characteristic of the upper reaches of the Northern Dales. And what we're seeing here is we're seeing lowland farming. We're seeing the lowland farmsteads where, as I mentioned earlier, you've got this centralized farmstead whereby the animals go out into the field, they come back to the farmstead. So all your core agricultural buildings are exactly that. They are at the core of your farmstead where the farmhouse is, in marked difference to the Northern Dales. So why do we value them? What do we know about them? Well, for starters, the Yorkshire Dales National Park, it's a national park. I don't know how familiar everyone is with sort of the legislation of national parks and how they're managed, but national parks as protected landscapes have special qualities. Things for which they are particularly well known and which their management and their conservation through planning and through project work should always be driving towards supporting those special qualities. Here, one of the special qualities of the Yorkshire Dales National Park specifically, and this is the exact quote from it, the landscape is famous for its man-made patchwork of dry stone walls, traditionally built barns and hay meadows. It's recognised at that level, so protected within the legislation that designates a national park as a protected landscape. Barns are mentioned right up there, traditionally built barns, dry stone walls and hay meadows. So that's why we care about them from a management perspective. I've talked a little bit earlier about why I care for them from an aesthetic perspective and from a historical perspective. So they're worthy of preservation. They are worthy of conservation. Two separate things. So there's an argument there, perhaps a debate to be had about conservation and preservation. But they are under threat. They're very much under threat, in fact. They're a dwindling resource, and this is, let me just show. So, and they are focused on specific areas. So this is a heat map showing concentrations of field barns, specifically isolated barns away from the farmstead. And this is Swaledale again, Swaledale, Arkengarthdale, and in fact you can see a little bit of Wensleydale just peeking in at the bottom here, and Malastang up there. What that in effect is showing, you don't need to know about the numbers. What that's showing is that there are huge concentrations all along the valley bottom, of Swaledale. It's one of the main foci of field barn, isolated barn architecture in the national park. Let me, again, in exactly the same way as with the large to small farmsteads, let me flip over to the west side to Garsdale and Dentdale. Much fewer all of a sudden. In fact, you can just see in the top right here, there's the top of Swaledale, and here on the centre right, you can see the area around Hawes and Gale in Upper Wensleydale. But in comparison, yes, okay, we see a little bit of the continuation of that in Upper Dentdale and Upper Garsdale, but nowhere near the degree at which it dominates and characterises the landscape of Upper Swaledale and Upper Wensleydale. And they're like I say, they're under threat. They're not suited. Barns are not suited to, by and large, to modern agriculture and modern rural living, the rural infrastructure. So if a barn goes out of use, so say the barn in the top right here has lost its roof, that can happen remarkably quickly. You lose a few roof slates because it's not in use, a couple of winters, and you've lost your roof structure. As soon as you've lost the timber structure, what happens is what we see in the top left. The tops of the walls get penetrated by water. The timbers come down and they often lever out sections of the wall. And you can go from a complete barn to just a ruin in the landscape in a remarkably short space of time when these are not actively used and lived in buildings. They are not, as Rob's photo in the bottom left shows, they are not designed to, particularly roadside barns, to withstand the pounding that, say, quarry traffic gives them. And there are a lot of quarries, there's a lot more industry, there are a lot busier roads now in the Yorkshire Dales than when they were originally built. Some are adapted and reused, as in the photo in the bottom right. This is a particularly good example, I like this one. What they've done is they've punched a huge door for machinery in the gable end, fitted it with wooden doors, a huge doorway fitted with wooden doors, and that is now a machine store, farm machinery store out within an arable landscape. Yet it's retained its features. It's surviving in the landscape. It's preserving the memory of what it was. Okay, so here's a big pair of slides coming up. We talk about it being under threat. This is the entire Yorkshire Dales National Park, including the extension area of the Orton Fells, which now touches the Lake District. This is the concentration of field barns in 1910, as taken from the 1910 Ordnance Survey maps. So you can see what I was talking about, this core concentration around Swaledale, Wensleydale, and its subsidiary dales, Bishopdale and Coverdale. It's very much the dispersed single field barn is a Northern Dales phenomena, though it is reflected in the Southern Dales in Craven in these larger agglomeration like field barn complexes, and then a little bit more in Dendale and Garsdale. So the next slide shows exactly the same thing, but barns surviving today. So I will flick back and forth between those. There, that's what we have now. So one more time, that's what we had in 1910, and that's the concentration we have now. 40%. We've lost 40% in terms of, as a broad figure, in the last 100 years. Now, I happen to know that a handful of those were converted into housing. Most of the Coverdale ones were probably converted by my uncle, actually, but we don't talk about that too much. But a huge amount of them have just fallen out of use because they are no longer viable as part of the agricultural landscape, and therefore they become ruins in the landscape. So we're into the final stretch now. We're nearly 10 past, so I'll rattle through these last few. What are we doing about it? This is the question, is how do we deal with this? We've said what the value is. We said we'd love these buildings. They're an integral part of the landscape. They're worthy of conservation, yet they're disappearing. So how do we deal with that? What's the next step? Bear with me while I explain the Sanford Principle. National parks have two key purposes. In legislation, they are legislated as protected landscapes to have two key purposes. They have to conserve and enhance the natural beauty and cultural heritage of the area. So they have to conserve and enhance the reasons why that landscape has been designated. And they also have to promote enjoyment of that landscape. Now, I'm sure it's very obvious to everyone that those two priorities can often conflict. If you're promoting enjoyment and tourism and people coming and visiting these places, sometimes that can conflict with conserving and enhancing the natural beauty and the cultural heritage. The Sanford Principle is a guiding principle that all national parks employ. If it appears there is a conflict, conserving and enhancing takes precedence. That's basically what it says. Of your two things, the greater weight must go to conserving and enhancing. So we now know that's what we have to do. Yes, we need people to enjoy these. Yes, we need to promote tourism, promote the rural economy, but conserving and enhancing must take precedence. So the ways in which they are currently managed, we manage through designation. This is legislated protection as historic monuments. This is a map of the Swaledale and Arkengarthdale Barns and Walls Conservation Area. It's the biggest conservation area we've got. It is therefore protected in legislation by the 1990 Act that allows for the creation of conservation areas. It specifically excludes all the settlements of Swaledale, but it means that if you want to demolish a barn in Swaledale, it requires planning permission because you are demolishing a building in a conservation area. So that is a huge thing. Instantly, we can start to manage things through the planning process with legal backing. This is the main way in which we manage it because people want to convert barns. This is a successful and an unsuccessful, I would argue, before and after series. In the bottom, we have one of these big Craven barns, these lathe houses, make very nice houses, it turns out. And actually, I would argue that from the bottom left to the bottom right, this is a successful redevelopment. It's maintained the existing openings. It's maintained the cart entry, in fact, turned it into a garage. It hasn't punched all manner of new windows in. It's preserved the chimney stack. It's actually, and this is the key word, it's legible. Its history is legible. Someone can read that as a barn, as that it used to be a barn, even now as it's a house. I would argue that the top left to top right isn't quite as successful, in as much as it's taken a very blank facaded barn defined by two tiny little windows and two adjacent doors, and it has made something really rather interesting out of it, including that I don't know what's going on with that oriel window. But so it's illustrative of how we manage barns and farm buildings in the planning process. Nearly finally, this is just really worth saying because this was it hasn't really taken off and it hasn't been reused, but this was an experimental pod that was inserted into a field barn in Swaledale that's completely unsuitable for any other development because it's isolated in the landscape. It has no infrastructure, no utilities. If you put any of that in, it would completely destroy its setting. So what they put was this built wooden pod for, in effect, it's like turns it into a little mini holiday cottage, quite rustic, but it can be taken out. And in fact, it was demonstrated that it could be taken out without any impact on the barn itself. It's a fantastic idea, and it's the kind of innovation that we need to be looking at in terms of conserving barn heritage. And then through engagement, talking to people, that's what engagement means. We archaeologists, we say engagement a lot. We say community project, we say all of these buzzwords. What it means is actually going out and talking to people. And I've been talking about barns and farms this as historical documents, as illustrative of these disappeared farming regimes. Let's not forget about people. There is a huge folk knowledge within the Yorkshire Dales, and this was vividly sort of illustrated. This fabulous project that was run by the National Park called Every Barn Tells a Story in Muka Parish, which is one of the main concentrations of field barns. And they went to talk to a particular gentleman and asked if they could go and, if he had any memories of the field barn that was just out near his house in the farm. And he said, the name is Cowas, which, for those of you who don't speak fluent Swaddle, what the gentleman said to us, no, you, sir, you are mistaken. The building you are referring to as a field barn is actually called a cow house. So that's now Every Cowas Tells a Story for part of that project. We've got to engage with the local people. We've got to gather these stories because that is fundamental to them. These are lived in buildings. They are used buildings. They have a life. They had many, many different lives. And all of that historical development is written within their architecture, within their development, within their surviving features, and within the people, the minds of the people who still live around and use them. I'm going to wrap up there. I think, yes, 8:15. So I've hit myself well, I say self-imposed target. It actually was a very strict target given to me. I am, however, going to take 1 or 2 more minutes of your time before we drop back for questions. I am allowed to advertise the upcoming Great British Dig TV series, which will be airing on More 4 on 9 p.m. on Wednesday evenings, starting on the 17th, Wednesday the 17th of February. This is not just me being a corporate shill. Solstice Heritage were actually really fortunate to help out a lot with that show. We really hope it's a big success. It's a program entirely based around community archaeology. So I don't know, Time Team crossed with something to do with the community and making people dig up their own gardens. It was a fabulous experience. We hope it's a real success, and anyone who can spread the word on that and support that, we'd really appreciate it. That's the Great British Dig on More 4, starting on Wednesday the 17th of February. Right, thank you very much. I will stop sharing my screen now, and I will throw over to Pan, who will be moderating the questions.
Right, the first question is, when did the field barn system start?
Okay, yeah. Honestly, we don't know. And I love being able to start an answer with that. It's incredibly prevalent in, like I say, in the Northern Dales. And the Northern Dales have a strong Scandinavian heritage to their dialect, to a lot of the place names. Gunnerside and Muka Parish are the absolute hotspots for surviving field barns in the sort of dispersed meadow landscape. So we know that it will have been from the medieval period. This will have been a farming, sort of a farming regime that was in place at that. I think we can probably suspect that it went back beyond that into, from at least the Anglo-Scandinavian period, into this sort of the early medieval, where there are great changes. But the simple answer is that our surviving evidence are the barns themselves. And there was a great rebuilding in the Yorkshire Dales. Well, there's a great rebuilding across the country, but in the Yorkshire Dales, our surviving buildings are all 18th and 19th century, with the odd hint of a late 17th century aspect to them. So we only have that evidence since the late 17th century. And as I pointed out in one of the slides, the potential evidence that the stone field barns might be replacing earlier timber crook frame barns. It's not certain, but that would push us back into the late medieval period at least. So I don't have a definitive answer. My suspicion is it's at least from the early medieval period. I'd love to say it was, oh yes, it's Iron Age, absolutely, but no, we have to follow the evidence.
Right. And would they have been in use with communal farms? Would they have had communal farms in the 17th and 18th century in these kind of areas?
Not really, no. Well, it's possible, but I don't think I think it's much more the exception rather than the rule. We do have good documentary evidence for a lot of farming that goes on, and I go back to Swaledale and Wensleydale as sort of these core areas, but they are also very, very heavily based on lead mining as well, particularly Swaledale, and quarrying. In Wensleydale, the huge Stag's Fell quarries are still there, survived beautifully from a couple of centuries ago. And we know from historical documents that we get a lot of minor farmers or quarryman farmers. So this idea of a very sort of like a mixed lifestyle, a mixed, not employment isn't the right word, but that it's earning a living through a variety of things. So they may not have been single farmers, but we've got census data showing that these people, it was a farmer in one farmer or one family in a farmhouse, but they also supplemented their income by being miners, being quarrymen, working in other ways. It's single ownership is what we commonly see rather than sort of like communal or agglomerated farms in that respect.
Right. Another question. Did the cows live in the barns all the time?
Most of the time, and that is what's characteristic of it. You would need, I mean, animals get sick and they need to be brought back to, they need to be brought back to somewhere where they can be tended to. So just the vagaries of everyday life and everyday agriculture means that you have to move your animals around a little bit. But that is very much the core of what's distinctive about it, as opposed to what we see from modern agriculture. Or lowland agriculture, where, yeah, for the majority of the time, the cattle lived out there and people went around and they tended to them and they milked them, and that would have been miserable in winter.
Right. Are there any smaller farm building types in the Dales? And if so, how well do they survive, like pigsties, poultry houses and things?
Yeah, and in fact, we get combined hennery piggeries, which is one of my favourite words ever. They tend to be within the core of the farmstead. So where you've got your thing very much related to dairying is out, it's dispersed. Where we have surviving piggeries or hennery piggeries or just chicken houses or whatever, they are small and they are attached to the main farm building. Again, a generalization, but that is the general picture we have. They don't go out into the fields as well. And sheep farming is a relatively new innovation. That sounds terrible. It's using relatively new to like denote the early 20th century. But yeah, we do get these smaller buildings in the farms. We do get combined hog houses, which are hog as in hogget, sheep, not hog as in pig, which are very similar to field barns in as much as the sheep live in the bottom floor and then their fodder is in the top floor and is fed down through holes to their feeding racks. They are sort of a distant cousin of field barns, and they're normally about the same size, and they are much less frequent in terms of their survival than the field barns.
And who would have built them? Would they have been specialist building gangs, or would the farm workers have built them?
Mostly, I think I think it'll be a mix. I think a lot of stuff is built by the people, like the farmer themselves, but there's clearly a level of skill to certain aspects of them that would require a craftsperson. So things like the coin stones, lintels, door jambs, all of that tends to be well-dressed grit stone. That's typically the building material used, locally sourced. And okay, you could get that wholesale from the quarry pre-dressed, but keying all that together and making it structurally sound is something which would, I suspect, require a level of skill beyond just the repairing of dry stone walls or the building of rough cobbled mass walling that the average farm owner would do. We do have some examples where we can see definitely a set of barns has been built by the same person around the same time, where say there's one farm where, I don't know whether it's transferred to someone with money, and all of a sudden you get in the area around it, you get 4 or 5 barns all built with a very, very distinctive sort of aesthetic flair to them, like a continuous string course of through stones in a really nicely dressed red sandstone that someone just said, oh, well, that'll be lovely, let's do that. And then they've done it on all of their barns. So that's clearly the same hand, but these are part of the idea of vernacular architecture. Is it's so general, so of the people, so practical, yet with these aesthetic flourishes, that it's difficult to tie it to a real, like say, yeah, such and such built that. So yeah, sorry, I've talked around that a lot. I'm not given a brilliant answer, but the answer is probably a bit of both.
Right, we've got quite a lot of questions.
Wow.
Quite a few along the same lines. So here's one, and there are several similar ones. For barns with strong survival of historic features, how would you preserve them, and could you make them into heritage attractions, perhaps, with new public rights of way?
Yeah, you absolutely could. The problem is, and I think everyone knows before I say it, is money. It's expensive. It's expensive to maintain a stone-built traditional building in whatever form and in whatever setting. It's expensive to maintain it if it's not serving a practical purpose. So that's why they start to fall into ruin, because it's just not viable. It's not economically viable. Where there are outstanding features surviving, like I presume people are thinking about some of that, like the graffiti that I showed in some of the slides earlier. Yes, you could, but it would require a very generous grant from someone and money in perpetuity, virtually, to maintain that. You could put a lot of money into it so that the upkeep doesn't really start to kick in for, say, 10, 15 years to a great degree. But then 10, 15 years down the line, heritage attractions have to be self-funding, unfortunately, or else at some point in the future, they will go to rack and ruin. And that's just the practicalities of it. So yes, it would be, from my point of view, I would absolutely love it if there was some fund of money that could in perpetuity create the Yorkshire Dales Barns Walk Trail, where we turned every couple of field barns in every dale into bothies, and we could walk around it, and there were enough people doing it, and there was a charity that was founded that people donated to make sure that all of these were constantly in use and constantly being renovated. But the practicality of doing that is such that no one's taking it on, and there is quite often a decision made for buildings where there isn't something such as that graffiti, a really beautiful piece of historical information, that actually let them fall down, because if they're a ruin in the landscape, at least they're still in the landscape, and consolidating them as a ruin is a viable thing. If a barn has half fallen down, well, just go and stop it falling down even more, but leave it as a consolidated ruin so it's stable. That's actually a viable way of dealing with it, and that is the approach that has been followed occasionally. So it's a thorny old issue, it really is.
This is an interesting question here. What sort of building would you select to become contemporary vernacular architecture?
That's an odd one, isn't it? Yeah. Ooh. I'm a big fan of housing. Now, that seems weird to say, but I really like 20th century housing. As a building historian, I find early 20th century housing fascinating, sort of late Victorian through Edwardian, and then into that mid 20th century suburbia, which has its very distinctive style. I think where we choose to live is often the best expression of vernacular architecture, whether it be tasteless 90s mock Tudor mansions in Newcastle, or right now, I think we're in a really bland state. Right now, the defining vernacular of our time, and I'm not very happy about it, are these sorts of like mass-produced, what are slightly nastily called Barrett box houses, where this copy and paste housing of new build. I don't like them, but I think that's our vernacular at the moment, and I think we're currently sort of pushing against that. I think there's going to be a railing back against that soon, I hope anyway, and we're going to start to see a return to more individuality in our house buildings, perhaps referencing like arts and craftsy things, this rural aesthetic. That would be lovely. But yeah, if you walk around our green and pleasant land now and see what's being built, it's slightly soulless. Red brick, unfortunately.
Right, two last questions. One going back to the function of the barns, and it's a question: didn't they need separate dairy / cheese making facilities?
Yes, they did, and that was at the farmhouse where it was done within the farm, or certainly later in the life of this, there would be cheese factories, but in essence what they are is one farm that is geared up to accept the dairy products for processing, the milk for processed milk and cream from several nearby small farms and do all the processing. So they may have had a smaller catchment of field barns and land themselves, but they would have acted more as a central processing for the dairy products, making the cheese itself. But yeah, quite often it was very much still a cottage industry in the times we're talking about. It was all things within one farm, which is why it didn't survive sort of monoculture mechanization well at all, because that is an expensive way of doing things when you're competing.
And just to finish up, what was the author and the book title that showed the interior plan of the field barns? Oh,
sorry, that's Robert White. So Robert White, was the senior archaeologist at the Yorkshire Dales National Park. He has published lots on it. The best intro, which references quite a lot of his other work, is the actual, the history of the Yorkshire Dales guidebook that is published by the Yorkshire Dales National Park, was written by Robert. And that gives you a run from the Ice Age, well, actually it does before that, it does geology, but the Ice Age right the way through to the present day. And yeah, that's just the Yorkshire Dales by Robert White. I should also very quickly throw out a reference to Hartley and Ingleby, John Hartley and Mary Ingleby, which is Life and Tradition in the Yorkshire Dales. It is the text by two women who basically catalogued in the mid 20th century the folk memory that was gradually dying out of the late 19th century rural traditions of the Yorkshire Dales. It's packed with amazing photography of all of these sorts of things, like field barns, landscapes, inside old farmhouses, lead mining, turf cutting, everything. And that's Hartley Ingleby's Life and Tradition in the Yorkshire Dales. It's a fabulous book.
Right, well, thank you very much for answering all those questions, and I'll hand back to Bill.
Jim, thank you so much. It just makes us remember how you filled us with enthusiasm and got us going on our project here, from digging our garden to digging huge trenches through that causeway. So thank you again, Jim. I do hope that everybody's enjoyed tonight's presentation. Hopefully we'll get Jim back for more in the near future. But notwithstanding that, we do welcome your feedback, so please do give us it. I've also got a few thank yous as well, and to the Lottery Heritage Fund. They have supported us, and that has helped us provide and allow us to get this webinar on. I'm going to promote our book again. It's still here. We still have a few copies. Details are on our website, or you could give myself or my wife Anna a ring on 01845 27717. We have further webinars coming up, and the next one is on the 4th of February. We have Professor Chris Gerard. Fascinating subject, this actually. Lost Lives, New Worlds. And this is the story of the Scottish soldiers who were captured at the 1650 Battle of Dunbar, and what happened to them and their fate at Durham. So that's coming up next, and I can really, really recommend that. Okay, so until then, as ever, please do keep safe and well. Good night from me.